Hey everybody, Joseph Rothschild here, aka MBT, back with another episode of Locals Live. This is another in a long series of videos in which I tried to make Nekroz playable, and what's that? A field center from Pro Play Games! What a wonderful time to segue into my first talking point. If you are in the Dallas-Fort Worth area this weekend, you can see me and a little-known YouTuber named CMO commentating on the PPG desk for the Pro Play Tour. You can also follow on Twitch at twitch.tv/PPGYGO. I am responsive to chat all day and will definitely read your message, your hate mail, whatever you want to send my way. Anyway, this is played at Side Scrollers in New Jersey. Shouts out to Side Scrollers. Fantastic local. Cannot recommend it enough. I am not sponsored by them or anything. I actually rolled up this week without a mat, and that really cool Samus mat you're seeing is drawn by the shop owner. They have a side business designing mats, and they allowed me to rent it for the purposes of the video. I am playing Nekroz. My opponent is playing Orcust. They are blind seconding, something I don't figure out at first. That's great news for me, because my main turn 1 play is probably the only way I'm able to win this game. For those of you that don't know, I've been fiddling with Ritual Goodstuff for a little bit of time now, and I've landed on a build that I feel is particularly consistent, but it does lack a lot of the explosivity that I wish the deck had. I unfortunately just don't know how to resolve that problem. There's just not very many rituals that are explosive. You've got maybe Lord of the Red, but other than that, and the Shino Birds, I really don't know what I could be putting in this to give the edge over a deck like Orcust that it's just so resilient, so consistent, and so adaptable. So, a quick roll for my opponent, a 3, and this is the lowest roll I've probably ever won a die roll with, a 4. Alright, well, we'll select first. I have no problems playing from this position, and we'll see what we can get done. Now, one problem with the Nekroz deck is it has two very disparate lines. The first one wants to not use its normal summon, so you can tribute summon a copy of Majesty's Fiend? Yes, that's the one I'm playing. The other one does want to use its normal summon to facilitate a setup involving Gale Dogra. Both of them are incredibly explosive, but only one of them can really floodgate Orcust out of the game entirely. So we're going to lead with a copy of Nekroz of Colossalus. One thing this deck does is search about 1,000 times a turn. So you really want to identify where the choke points are going to be if you're in the Orcust player's position. Because they're blind seconding, of course, they are on a ton of hand traps, and we can expect to see at least one. We find ourselves a copy of Nekroz Kaleidoscope, because ideally we're going to want to make Unicore, since we don't have the necessary resources to go for our other play. We're going to discard a copy of, ooh my god, what is that? A Mono Iwato in the opener, always. And then our opponent's going to reveal an Ash Blossom. This is the worst possible time this could happen. The remainder of our hand does fat nothing, and unfortunately we're forced to just pass it back, I believe. We'll give the deck to our opponent to cut. During the shuffling they say, Nekroz, huh? I don't know what this deck does. To which I reply, yeah, it actually doesn't do a whole lot of anything. Because we activated the effect of Incantation Chalice Slime and failed to perform a ritual summon over the course of the turn, we also go down to 5,500 points of life. So all our opponent has to do is assemble, basically any combo at all, and we have lost. They're going to look through the hand. It looks like they do have the necessary resources. They're going to lead with a Reinforcement of the Army. That Reinforcement of the Army is going to get a Warrior Die Greffer, the Dark version. Yep, there he is. And, of course, this enables almost every play in Orcust. It's Armageddon Knights number 2. Crazy that there was a time that this and Armageddon Knight were both at 3. Thankful that is no longer the case. They're going to discard a Harp Horror, and I think, God, I wanted to Ash this, but if the Harp Horror is being discarded, then I guess I have to Ash that. They send a copy of Nightmare Orcust, and that's about all she wrote. I mean, what am I going to do? I'll Ash the Harp Horror, but of course there's already a Nightmare Orcust in the graveyard, so they still have the ability to get whatever they want. They'll use the Nightmare Orcust in order to send a copy of Wand, and then they'll get back the Harp Horror anyway. I hate this game! They'll do just that, using Harp Horror to give this monster 800 attack points. That's going to put me dangerously close to lethal, provided they can assemble anything. And, of course, World Legacy World Wand can reborn a, I believe, World Legacy or Orcust card from the Banished Zone. They'll select the Harp Horror, which has 1,700 attack, a non-negligible amount. Now, if you took a quick look at the hand, you could see there's a couple of extenders, but my opponent goes for what is the funniest of all of the remaining plays. Using one of the cards in his hand, a Monster Reborn, he brings back the Amano Iwato. Now, the literate among you may recognize that this is actually an illegal play. Amano Iwato, of course, has a condition that it can't be special summoned. I will forgive you for forgetting it, by the way, because, of course, it doesn't come up very often. Special summoning Amano Iwato is possible using the effect of Shino Baroness Peacock, and that's a play that this deck performs regularly. As a result, I tend to forget that that text exists. Don't worry, we'll get him by cheating in the next one. So we're going to add up these real quick, and that is, in fact, over 5,500. So it looks like as soon as he goes to battle phase, we are going to be forced to scoop it up and move to game 2. Not a very good showing for game 1, but you take your losses in stride. So for game 2, you can see we've boarded into Super Polymerization. Now, space in the extra deck is a little tight, despite the fact we don't use it. We're going to lead with a Pot of Extravagance, and this is where the unfortunate cheat during this game happens. I continue to draw cards over the course of the turn, despite activating Pot of Extravagance. If you're playing against an opponent on a rogue deck, routinely you're going to feel like they're allowed to go through their plays just because their deck isn't very good. Do recall that generically strong cards like Pot of Extravagance have text. Don't make my mistakes. So we have both Chalice Slime and a copy of Incantation Inception in hand. Now, Inception is incredibly potent with Chalice Slime because, of course, you can discard it for its effect, special summon an Incantation, and then send the Incantation to the graveyard to return the Incantation Inception to your hand, activating its effect as special another Incantation from your deck. It's an easy way to cycle through Candle plus Talismandra if you fail to draw Pen Silver or Bookstone. We're going to use Talismandra's effect. Our opponent for game 2 is going to reveal that he does have one hand trap, the Infinite Impermanence. We don't have anything to deal with that. I believe there's a Called by the Grave in our hand, but of course that only really works if you're allowed to banish a monster. Afterwards, we're going to go ahead and burn our normal summon on a Gale Dogra. Now, the downside of Infinite Impermanence is we aren't able to go into our extreme power play, which is Majesty's Fiend, but the upside is we know there's not going to be a second one for this Gale Dogra. We're going to activate Gale Dogra's effect, sending a copy of Herald to graveyard. Gale Dogra is a contentious include in these decks. It starts your life at 2,000 points effectively, but it adds 2 cards from your deck to your hand, and that can be even more powerful. Over the course of a turn, it can easily be a +2 or a +3, especially combined with Nekroz Kaleidoscope and Unicorn. We're now going to activate the Grave effect of Incantation Inception, getting rid of our copy of Talismandra so we can fetch a copy of Candle. We're going to use Candle's effect in order to add a copy of Nekroz Kaleidoscope to our hand. Now, when you're activating Gale Dogra twice in one turn, and your opponent is on a deck that can easily put out a monster that can attack over it for the remainder of your 2,000 life points, you start to think of ways you can get it off your side of the board. We, of course, have a multitude of them, but one of them is activating the effect of Nekroz of Valkyris. Of course, this is impossible in the same turn that we activate Pot of Extravagance, but again, apologies, I am not particularly good at remembering this. We're going to go ahead and get Nekroz of Valkyris, and then use Nekroz Kaleidoscope to send a Blue Eyes Alternative White Dragon to the graveyard. It's the 12 that I own, people, in order to special summon both Valkyris and Unicorn. We'll use Valk's effect, which tributes cards you control or in your hand to draw cards off the top of your deck. Routinely, what we're searching for here is something like a Ash Blossom, Hand Trap, Super Polymerization. We find a Brionac and what looks like a Preparation of Rites. Preparation's insane here because it allows us to go into Saphira, which will protect our monsters with a Hymn of Light that's in the graveyard. We're going to take a quick look at the graveyard here. Of course, there's not a whole lot left we still have left to do. We have about 8 cards in hand, but only about 3 of them do anything. We're going to activate Preparation of Rites in order to fetch a copy of Saphira, and then of course we have to find Hymn of Light. It always hides from me. There it is. While I don't like sending a Brio from my hand to the graveyard as fodder, rather than activating its effect, I think it's not that big of a deal here. We're going to activate Hymn of Light, thumb through our hand to see what we could get rid of. Of course, the card you want to be sending is Ben 10, so you can then add the Majesty's Fiend to hand, but normal summoning a Saphira works too. After that, we're going to set a copy of Super Polymerization and pass it back. You'll notice we have a copy of Extra Foolish Burial in our hand as well. I don't want to use that in the same turn that I set Super Polymerization, because hilariously, there's effect text on Extra Foolish Burial that prevents you from setting cards. Again, I can't apologize enough for this, but we are going to activate an illegal Saphira activation at end step. Always be keeping track of everything your opponent's doing, and if you don't want a game loss, probably keep track of your own cards as well. So my opponent's quickly going to ask what all these cards do, which is fair. A lot of people haven't seen Nekroz for the past half-decade, and I'm more than happy to explain them. Effectively, Saphira does absolutely nothing, Valkyris does absolutely nothing, and Nekroz Unicorn is an AoE negator. My opponent, of course, is primed to go second, and will start with a copy of Orchestrated Return. They're going to discard, what I believe is a symbol skeleton, and I have a quick thought here about using Ash. I really can't pass up the ability to prevent a draw 2, especially when they have no Orcust in the graveyard to reborn with the symbol. They're then going to activate Mind Control, taking my copy of Unicorn. I do call their bluff here. You can see I have a Trishula in hand, but I elect not to use it, thinking, well, if they go for anything frightening, I can always super polymerization them out of it. They're instead going to discard a World Legacy World 1 to special summon a copy of Dark Grepher, kind of revealing to us that they don't have a way to play through all of this. He leans over and says, the Ash really screwed me up here. There's nothing you can really effectively link into, I don't even think he's playing Nightmare Phoenix. There's a lot of Shadal cards in the extra deck because game 1 he's on Shadal Fusion. Of course, that comes out pretty quickly when you realize your opponent isn't playing anything in the extra deck. Instead, he'll just pass back, allowing me to go off as much as possible before he dies. Now, one position you never really want to be in, especially when you're playing a combo deck, is revealing to your opponent what your main game plan is. If I were to do something here like make Majesty's Fiend, I would telegraph to my opponent that they need to be on single-target monster negation going into Game 3. So it's important just to repeat plays that your opponent has already seen if you're in a position as winning as ours. Additionally, if you are an opponent with time, the first game only took 2 or 3 minutes, it behooves you to let your opponent play out their game-winning combo just to fetch a little bit more information about what they're up to. It's unlikely that I'm going to be able to stall long enough to turn this one game 2 into a tie, so my opponent is going to try and fiend as much info as they can from me. We're going to use the great effect of Incantation Inception after adding a mirror to hand. Inception is going to special a Candle, and I recognize I don't really have the zones to do everything I want here. We're going to be able to activate Trishula, but it's not very good. Trishula here just represents a beater because our opponent has no cards in hand. Unlike the Synchro Trishula, this Trishula has to be able to get one from the hand, one from the field, and one from the graveyard. I do a little bit of wonky math here. I activate Nekroz Cycle, then realize there are not enough monster zones. Come on, Konami, just move the extra monster zone down one so decks like Ritual can use it. Instead, I'm going to say, okay, let's just go to battle phase, I suppose. There's still enough damage on board to clear out our opponent's life points. We'll attack into the Dark Grepher and then directly with a Valk, a Trish, and a Saphira. That's very slightly more than 8,000, so our opponent's going to scoop them up. For Game 3, our opponent has elected to allow us to go first. This game is a bit of a shock for me. Usually I board out of my going first things, like my Majesty's setup, but I elected not to here because I recognize that the Shinobirds are probably not going to get a chance to activate. Peacock doesn't usually have the requisite targets against Orcust unless they've gone for the Babel play. And if they have, she's usually not making it on board. We're going to lead with a copy of Brio. Brio is one of the most flexible cards in the deck, and one of the reasons to play the archetype in and of itself. We're going to use Brio in order to get a Nekroz monster or a Nekroz spell or trap by way of Kloss to our hand. I just have to decide what behooves me to add. One of the very, very difficult things about this deck is it's very easy to get choice paralysis when navigating lines like this. If something's allowed to resolve, you need to be cognizant of what's likely to be resolvable in the next 2 or 3 actions as well. I like to get Colossalus, and we'll use his effect to add this copy of Kaleidoscope to hand. Kaleidoscope is a very good blind add because routinely you can just use it to send a Herald. We're going to do just that, using Kaleidoscope to get a copy of Unicorn to our side of the field, and now the absolute worst case scenario for us is that our opponent has to play through him. Using the Herald in the graveyard, we are going to add a copy of Ben 10 to our hand. I like to get Ben 10 before I get Saphira for 2 reasons. Firstly, pre-preparation of rights searches Saphira, and secondly, you can get into a Brionac via something like Cycle, tributing Ben 10, and still find your way to a Majesty's Fiend. We're going to activate pre-prep here. It doesn't get ashed, and I thank the good Lord above. We're going to add a Hymn of Light and a Saphira to hand. So it looks like we finally have opened the combo that locks special summoning. We're going to activate Bookstone in hand, revealing Hymn of Light. We'll special summon this copy of Bookstone, and then from our deck, special summon another monster, which could be anything, truthfully. Usually I like to get a Chalice Slime here because it sets up for future plays, but I believe we already have one in hand. I think about Valk real quick. Valk is a pretty good option to ensure that your monsters aren't run over. I look at a Chalice Slime for a second, then finally decide, yes, the only way we lose this game is probably our monsters getting attacked over. I'll activate Hymn of Light, sending this copy of Ben 10 to special summon a copy of Saphira. Then I'll activate the Tribute effect of Ben 10 in order to add a Majesty's Fiend to hand. With 2 incantations on our side of the field, they are perfect tribute fodder for said monster. This is about as good as our opens get. We're going to normal summon a copy of Majesty's Fiend, which locks our opponent from special summoning, and wish them the best of luck. So we've negated all of their extra deck monsters' effects. We've got Saphira and the requisite protection that Hymn of Light allows, and we've locked our opponent from specialing. Seems pretty good. At end step, we'll draw 2 cards and discard 1. You can see we draw into a second Chalice Slime, and I think, yeah, we can probably ditch it. So of the 3 cards, I think one is a Chalice Slime, the other is a Trishula, and the third is a Valkyrus. I'm feeling pretty good. Unfortunately, our opponent has one of the very few outs to this particular board. Their hand, of course, is sculpted to go second, as are most of theirs, but this one has Mind Control in it. This Mind Control, unfortunately, targets Majesty's Fiend, which is not a ritual monster, which means that I'm not able to negate it with a Trishula. You know what would have come in handy here is a Saravius, the Ancient and Ascendant, a card that you often see in Ritual Goodstuff, but I had cut. Silly me. I'll add it in the future. At this point, my opponent leans over and says, I'm going to give you something really, really cool for the on-screen duel. And let me tell you, folks, he did not disappoint. He's going to set a copy of, I think, Orcust Return, and then special a copy of Iron Dragon Tiamaton. So Iron Dragon Tiamaton is a card that can be special summoned if 3 of the 4 zones in a line are all filled. It doesn't have to be special to that zone, and when it's specialed, it destroys everything in the zone and prevents it from being used. Now, unfortunately for my opponent, I do have a card that prevents a Unicorn from going to the graveyard, but the play is still cool. I'm going to check Hymn of Light real quick. He wants to know if it's until the end of the turn or a single use. Unfortunately for me, it is the latter. Alright, he's now going to flip up this copy of Orcust Return, discarding, a Nightmare Orcust. And even if I had Ash, I don't know if I'd be using it there. Nightmare Orcust is just so powerful as a send. One of the benefits of these blind second decks with Orcust Return is that even if you're able to Ash their cards like Armageddon Knight, Scrap Recycler, and Dark Grepher, they can usually play through them, just ditching cards from their hand using cards like Orcust Return. Our opponent now activates Foolish Burial, who, and things have gone from bad to worse. There's so many good sends here. And he's going to immediately banish this copy of Harpour that he sent off of Foolish Burial in order to enable the entirety of his Orcust plays. Now, right now, he's just thinking, how am I going to remove this copy of Nekroz of Unicorn? And Battle comes up. Unfortunately, he knows that Battle isn't going to resolve the issue just yet. It's just going to get the Valkyrus out of my hand, but it means in main phase 2, any defensive wall he sets up is going to be extremely hard for me to get over without any monsters that deal damage. I'm going to take a quick look at the extra deck here. While Unicorn floodgates the effects of extra deck monsters, you can still make them, which is very problematic as many of them have more than 2,300 attack. Much more. You can see he's on Topologic 0 Voros. That's an incredibly interesting win condition for these blind second versions of Orcust. The Topologic monsters, of course, were the win conditions of the deck before we knew they were going to have extremely powerful in-theme links. After a quick perusal of the extra deck, he's going to activate the effect of Nightmare Orcust, targeting Iron Dragon Tiamaton. This card already has 2,000 attack points, so anything else is going to be cake. And shoot, it looks like he's pulling World Wand to the top, but is thinking about Gizmek as well. And into the graveyard World Wand goes. We'll save Gizmek for another time. The wand is particularly bad to me because it means he could banish it from the graveyard, special summon, oh, I don't know, hypothetically the Harp Horror, and make an easy Link 3 with his mind-controlled monster. While it can't attack this turn, it is a huge problem if it doesn't return to me. This is one of the fundamental issues with Ritual Goodstuff. While it's incredibly explosive and can routinely add about 15 to 18 cards from its deck to its hand the first turn, those cards aren't very good. Often they're just additional incantations, monsters that don't do anything if they're summoned, and useless Chalice Slimes. As a result, you're going to be hard-pressed to win any sort of best of 3 against a deck with any conceivable grind game whatsoever. Eking out a win over something like Orcust, Salamandrate, or even Sky Striker is often a lesson in futility, and always requires these incredibly broken cards like Majesty's Fiend. Without them, you're trying to play fair against a deck that is much better at it than you. After thumbing through the extra deck for a little bit, my opponent, I think, eventually decides that Link Summoning is not for him. This turn, with the boost from this copy of Orcust Nightmare, his Iron Dragon Tiamaton is much more than large enough to get over my copy of Nightmare Unicorn, and as a result, he'll just be able to proceed to battle phase to get the Valkyrus out of our hand, and then in main phase 2, put up a defensive enough wall that no longer will we be able to walk through his board. He's going to go to battle phase here and attack with Iron Dragon Tiamaton, prompting this copy of Valkyrus from my hand. We'll banish a Nekroz card from our graveyard in order to facilitate that play. This is a little hard. You can see we have a Trishula in our hand, and we want all of the remaining Nekroz cards that are in our graveyard to stay there. So we end up banishing Kaleidoscope, even though it has a grave effect. In main phase 2, our opponent is going to say, now I will do what I can to get this Majesty's Fiend off the field. Of course, leaving it on the field means it returns to me, and that is about the worst case scenario for them. So priority number 1 is going to be getting it off the field. They're going to send the copy of Harp Horror and the copy of Majesty's Fiend to graveyard, thinking about summoning a Galatea here. I don't know how good it is. Galatea, of course, is a very powerful monster, but with no effect is easy for us to run over. Saphira, despite doing almost absolutely nothing, is a heck of a chonker. The worst case for our opponent, now that this Majesty's Fiend is off the board, is that we're easily able to go into something like, say, a Trishula that he knows is in our hand, and then banish all of the relevant cards from his side of the field and graveyard. Something like an Orchestrated Babel would do wonders in terms of making his board live, but unfortunately doesn't do anything until this copy of Nekroz of Unicorn is off our side of the field. He looks at Ding for a second, and then reads the effect of Nekroz of Unicorn, trying to ensure that he wouldn't be able to send. Finally deciding, yeah, let's just make Dingirsu. This is probably good enough. It's got a fair amount of attack points, and it looks like we also have a quick look at the graveyard. Is it a... I think it is... Ooh, a follow-up Babel. This is extremely frustrating for me, because of course it means that now I have to contend with every grave effect. At end step we'll activate Saphira's effect, because this Majesty's Fiend was sent to our graveyard this turn. I take a second to decide what exactly I'm going to be discarding. We did draw into a lot of really good stuff here, as you're about to see. And I finally, I think, end up sending the prep rights. It doesn't look great, but, doesn't look fantastic knowing there's an Ash Blossom in hand either. So the Gale Dogra opens up a ton of new lines. We have an Ntis and I think one remaining Herald in our extra deck at the very least, so we might be able to make a play happen there. What we're currently lacking is a ritual spell. We're going to activate Gale Dogra's effect in order to send a Herald from our hand to the graveyard. We'll activate the grave effect of Herald, which our opponent will mull over for a second and then Ash. That's not that big of a deal for us. We can always activate the effect of Gale Dogra again. We're thinking real quickly. It's potentially not even worth sending a copy of Herald. Remember, we have a Chalice Slime in our hand, and should we activate the Chalice Slime, it's very possible we could just add the requisite mirror to our hand without having to expend a Dogra activation. That frees up the Dogra for sending something like Ntis, which could destroy one of our opponent's problematic monsters. I'm going to look at Tiamaton real quick and see if it actually resists destruction in any meaningful way. Thankfully, it does not, so I think... yeah, I mean, if we have a spare activation, I might as well send an Ntis from my extra deck to the graveyard and wipe the board a little bit before I'm forced to compete with Babel. We'll go ahead and do that, using Antissa's effect to destroy the Iron Dragon Tiamaton. From here, we'll activate the effect of Chalice Slime, discarding itself in order to get a spell from our deck to the hand. We're not discarding the remaining card in our hand, because the remaining card in our hand is a Candle. The Candle can recycle something like the Chalice Slime. We're going to special a Pensilver with this copy of Chalice Slime, and Pensilver, of course, returns a Ritual Monster from our graveyard to our hand. We're going to get Clausulus, and Clausulus is going to add a copy of Mirror. Our opponent, unfortunately, will reveal the last card in their hand, Droll and Lockbird. That is a huge problem for us. Now we can't activate the effect of Trishula because their hand is empty. Because of that, they're going to be able to reborn this copy of Dingirsu, and we are effectively shut out of the game. Ah, shoot! If only they had had anything but 2 activatable hand traps. Okay. We'll look at the graveyard real quickly. There's not a whole lot we can do in this scenario, it looks like, but just make Trishula anyway. Again, unlike the Synchro Monster, Nekroz of Trishula requires that you banish exactly 1 from your opponent's hand, field, and graveyard. If there's not 1 to be banished, you won't be doing it. So I'm going to count real quickly. We do need to get the Dogger off our side of the field. We are staring down a very beefy monster. We've got a 2, a 3, and it looks like a 4 in hand ought to do it. We're going to activate Mirror here. Ugh, and I hate to go Hellbent this quickly. But we will send the Candle from hand, banish the Clausulus from our graveyard, and send the Gale Dogger as well to special Trish. Now we are out of options. Our opponent has a Babel on their side of the field, which will bail them out of basically everything here. If they just didn't have the recurable bail, we might be able to do this, but they do, and as a result, it's going to be very hard for us to win. Our opponent's going to read Trish, who is a vanilla. Confirming real quick that, in fact, I will not be activating an effect here. Now I'll look at the graveyard real quick. Yeah, there's basically everything in the world that I fear. We will walk into the Dingirsu. It'll go to the graveyard, then we'll try to attack with Saphira. Now our opponent's going to activate the grave effect of Symbol Skeleton, targeting Dingirsu. That's fine with me. We'll walk into the Dingirsu with Saphira. As long as we can strand it in the graveyard, we should be fine. We'll attack directly with Unicorn, trying to salvage a little bit of damage here. They'll banish this copy of Harp Horror to special a monster from their deck. And it looks like the monster they elect to end on is a copy of Nightmare Orcust. Now, of course, if I destroy the Nightmare Orcust, they get to activate the Nightmare Orcust effect, targeting one of my monsters, and pop off. I really don't want that to happen, so I figure probably the best case scenario for me, no matter how it looks, is to pass. One of the other downsides to playing Ritual Goodstuff is that it has no possible time game to speak of. There is no conceivable universe in which we're able to stall long enough to win in time, because of course our monsters don't do anything in time and we hurt the hell out of ourselves with cards like Gale Dogra and Extra Foolish Burial. Our opponent will draw for turn, and really the only thing that gets us out of this situation is not a monster. I guess something like an Orcust Climax would do it, but a Scrap Recycler is pretty high on the list of top decks. They're going to use Scrap Recycler, unfortunately, to send anything they want to the graveyard here. They have extras, of course. They could send a Harp Horror, they could send a Symbol Skeleton. They could really send anything they want and be in pretty good shape. As long as they're first able to deal with the Nekroz of Unicorn, it doesn't really matter. They're going to send a Harp Horror, and then use Harp Horror's effect to special summon an Orcust from their deck. They'll elect to special a Symbol Skeleton, which, once it goes to the graveyard, will be able to enable the Dingirsu that's already there. Now I'm going to take a quick look through the extra deck. There's a ton of monsters he could special summon, but anything with over 2,300 attack points is going to do the trick. Quickly looking at his life point counter, that is correct. I have not done any damage this game. It looks like he's thinking about Topologic Trisbana. Now, there are scenarios in which Trisbana is able to banish monsters at its link points that are particularly potent against me. For example, if he put it facing this copy of Trishula, but I think he's more likely to not do that and just sit on it as a 2500 attack beater. Real quickly thinking about putting something at link point and deciding, no, we probably don't want to go for something like a burn kill when we could just actually beat you. So, with a copy of Trisbana and a copy of Dingirsu, he should be able to eat the remainder of the monsters by using this copy of Nightmare Orcust in order to pump one of his own. He'll attack into my copy of Nekroz of Unicorn, and suddenly the extra deck is once again live. Really bad news! Next, he's going to use the effect of Nightmare Orcust, which is in fact a quick effect because of Orchestrated Babel. That's going to send a Dark Machine from the deck to the graveyard. Unfortunately for me, that is a condition that does not only apply to Orcust monsters. You can see his thumb over the scale. Boy, Gizmek has been a real standout this format, huh? So with Gizmek in graveyard, this represents the entirety of my board being destroyed. This Dingirsu is, of course, very far above my Trishula right now, having gained several hundred attack points, and I am down to a healthy 1200. Thanks, Gale Dogra. My opponent's going to tabulate it real quickly and then think. Getting rid of the last incantation is sometimes a win and sometimes a lose. You want it not to stay on the field so your opponent isn't able to abuse effective incantation inception, but you also want to leave a monster on your opponent's side of the field so they can't activate the grave effects of the Nekroz ritual spells. He decides that it outweighs, and then in main phase 2, Link summons a copy of Galatea with 2 much larger monsters. Regardless, Galatea is much better than all of them because her effect allows him to set Disruption. Thinks for a second about what he's going to return. Of course, he has all the necessary pieces that he could ever desire in his banished zone and his graveyard, so it's not too big of a decision, eventually settling on a copy of Symbol Skeleton. Unfortunately for him, it looks like Orcust Crescendo is in the 8 cards Gizmek banished face down, baby! That seems to always be what happens to me, so he'll settle on a copy of Orcust Return and pass it back. Regardless, this is not a good position to be in. There are very few cards in my deck that out this board, and once he makes Dingirsu, that number of cards dwindles even further. Theoretically, I might be able to eat the Dingirsu with a particular set of draws, but I'd have to get quite lucky. He's going to reattach a copy of Orcust Nightmare now that there's a copy of Symbol Skeleton in the deck, and finally pass it back. And that's right, baby. I drew the Pot of Extravagance off the top every single time. Easiest game in the world. Alright, 15 cards in here. Now, as I alluded to earlier, extra deck space in this deck, despite the fact that you don't use the extra deck, is tight. You're on 3 copies of Herald, 3 copies of Ntis, and 10s and 11s, so you can routinely activate Nekroz Kaleidoscope. We draw 2 Super Polymerization. Now, Super Polymerization is a card that outs this board. Unfortunately, we're only on 1 of each individual Super Poly target, and there's the Starving Venom Fusion Dragon in my banished face-down cards. I go for a Nekroz spell here. At the very least, it'll be good fodder if my opponent's able to destroy 1 of my 2 Super Polymerizations, but I'm going to need him to either commit to a fusion monster, don't laugh, it could happen, or 2 monsters that share an attribute but not a type. That one seems slightly more likely, but unfortunately, Muddy Mud Dragon probably isn't going to win the game on his own. It's going to have to be an absolutely sweet one to get out of this, but technically, it is still possible. I'm going to look at my hand, set a copy of Super Polymerization. In fact, we might as well just set 2. I mean, there's a 1 or 2 scenarios in which they commit to something like a Shaddoll Fusion to pop one of these 2 set spells or traps, and then I'm able to immediately fuse it away. But the worst case scenario is they just go to battle phase. Our opponent's going to lead with a copy of Orcust Return, discarding a copy of Symbol Skeleton. Horrifying, by the way. Please don't go to battle. Please don't go to battle. Please overthink it. Come on. Okay, there's absolutely no way I'm going to convince him to play around Storming Mirror Force. He goes in, I activate Super Polymerization, he immediately sends his board away, and I reveal that my target's in the set face-down cards. So that's going to be it. A long, long Game 3, ending in a 2-1 for Orcust. I still have faith in this deck, and I'll see you next time.